My name is Philipp Johnson, Senior Advisor at Nordic Energy Research. Good morning and welcome everyone, listeners, panelists and speakers. I'm delighted to be able to welcome you to this webinar on reaching Nordic carbon neutrality, the first in a series of two, where we will deep dive into some of the results from our study, Nordic Clean Energy Scenarios. And this morning, you will get to know more about the role of bioenergy and negative emissions. This series of webinars are co-hosted by us at Nordic Energy Research together with Energiforsk. They will give a short introduction of themselves a bit later in the program. But I would like to start by giving a brief outline to who we are here at Nordic Energy Research. And we at Nordic Energy Research are the Nordic institution for cooperation on energy. We are the platform for cooperative energy research and analysis and development on the auspices of the Nordic Council of Ministers. And what we work to do is to achieve the Nordic 2030 vision of becoming the most sustainable and integrated region in the world. The tools we use to get there can be divided into 4 different boxes. We are funding energy research and energy research programs in the Nordics. We are conducting and procuring analysis to get the knowledge basis for a Nordic discussion on energy. We are providing secretarial support for some of the working groups under the Nordic energy ministers, and we are promoting the Nordic energy system and the cooperation we have in this sector. Today, I will go into one of the projects we've funded under our analysis umbrella, namely Nordic Clean Energy Scenarios. And from me, you will get a brief introduction to the overall framework that we've decided to use for this project, while the experts will deep dive into the specific results on bioenergy and negative emissions. So Nordic Clean Energy Scenarios is one of the largest efforts we've done here at Nordic Energy Research for the last 2-3 years. And it started back in 2019 when the Nordic Prime Ministers decided that they would like to step up the Nordic cooperation on energy, or on becoming a carbon neutral region. So the Nordic Prime Ministers, together with the Ministers of Energy and Climate, got together in Helsinki and decided that there should be an aim for the Nordic countries to become carbon neutral. And for us working within the sphere of energy, it was obvious that to be able to do this, we needed to provide we wanted to provide a knowledge basis on how to get there. We also have some background in working with these kinds of projects from earlier projects we've done. What you can see here are 2 earlier projects, namely Nordic Energy Technology Perspectives, that we did first back in 2013 in cooperation with the IEA, and then updated in 2016. But as most of you who are following the energy sector knows, not only have the ambitions been raised, but the technological realities has also changed dramatically in the last 5 years. So that's also a reason for why we wanted to make this new project, Nordic Clean Energy Scenarios, looking into how the Nordic countries can achieve carbon neutrality. We, of course, needed some help for doing this analysis, so we gathered together a large consortium of energy researchers and consultancies, and you can see all of their logos here. And we are very thankful for their efforts and for the amount of time they put into this project, and we get to know some of them better later in this program and in the next webinar as well. So moving into the overall framework of the project, what we wanted to do was to look into how the Nordic countries could achieve carbon neutrality. And this differs a bit from the earlier projects that I showed you, where we looked into how different levels of ambition impacted the results and how the energy sector could develop. But in all these three scenarios that we've developed for the Nordic Clean Energy Scenarios project, all scenarios achieve the same amount of carbon emission reductions in the Nordic countries. So in the first one, that one we called Carbon Neutral Nordics, we wanted to look into how the Nordic countries could achieve their national targets in the most cost-effective way. So in a way, you could say that this project or this scenario is the closest one to a cost optimization scenario. We wanted to supplement that scenario with one that we call the Nordic Powerhouse. And this is a scenario where the Nordic countries, in addition to cutting emissions in the Nordic countries, also helps take a larger role in the overall European transition, providing clean electricity and Power-to-X fuels to the rest of Europe as well. And we wanted to look into how climate neutral behavior could impact the energy system as well. So in the last scenario, we assume that the Nordic citizens are ready to do some changes in their lives that has a large impact on their energy consumption. So for instance, in this scenario, the passenger traffic on airplanes never goes above the level that we saw in 2019 and slightly declines towards 2050. And then we look into how would that impact the overall energy system. That's giving you the framework for how we have been framing the project. What we found was that based on all these three scenarios, we found a range of solutions. And these solutions could be gathered together into what we call the 5 solution tracks to carbon neutrality. And you're going to get a deep dive into 2 of them today, but I'll also briefly introduce them now. What you see here is the problem, if you would call it that. We have the fossil fuels and the accompanying emissions that we would like to get rid of in the Nordic countries. And then we have the 5 solutions that we've identified that could help to ease the transition and achieve carbon neutrality. So first and foremost, we have direct Altification. In all the 3 scenarios we have, this plays the largest role and are the key enabler of reaching carbon neutrality. But also in all of the 3 scenarios, we find that we need additional technical solutions as well. So we have Power-to-X, Bioenergy, carbon capture and storage, and Bioenergy carbon capture and storage. And these needs to be employed at different levels between the scenarios to the hard to abate sectors. On top of these 4 technical solutions, we've also looked into behavioral change. And that I think is an interesting result from the scenarios is that the behavioral change can either help or make the transition more difficult, but it doesn't take away the need for all of these 4 technologies. So even in the scenario where we look quite heavily into how the different Nordic citizens can reduce their emissions, we still need all the 4 technologies at some level as well. And with this introduction to the overall framework for the project, I would like to invite Markus Råke, CEO of Energiforsk and the project manager for the project, on the stage, and he will take you through the rest of the day. So welcome, Markus.
Thanks, Kevin. Great intro, and hello again, everyone. I'm luckily not the technical advisor of this project in terms of IT, but like Kevin said, I've been lucky enough to head this project. And without further ado, I'm going to leave the floor to Torjus Bolkesjö of the Norwegian University of Life Sciences, who's headed the work on bioenergy in this project. So we're going to, of course, dive much deeper into that topic right now. So take it away, Torjus.
So thank you, Markus. Can you now see my screen?
Yeah, no
That's
problem.
Great. So good morning, everybody, from crisp and clear Norway. I guess that weather is similar in all Nordics, and that in combination with record high electricity prices, I guess is a good setting for discussing one of these 5 solution tracks in the Nordic Clean Energy Scenarios, which is bioenergy. So as Kevin explained just recently, bioenergy is one of the 5 solution tracks, and it is worth mentioning that the role of bioenergy is dependent also on how much we rely on these other technical solution tracks in this figure. So when looking and diving into the results in this presentation, keep that in mind, that there are alternatives and there are pros and cons of the different solution tracks in the report that we will discuss today, and with particular emphasis then on bioenergy and then CCS, and bioenergy and CCS. So bioenergy is among these solution tracks definitively not a new kid on the block in the Nordic energy system, as illustrated in this figure showing the total share of bioenergy in the different countries. And as you can see in this figure, especially in Finland, Sweden, and Denmark, bioenergy has a significant share of the total energy consumption. And comparing data from 2014 and 2019, we see that actually there is a increasing trend in these shares. And it is significantly higher in these Nordic countries than in the EU 28 as an average. More interesting probably than looking at historical figures is to try to look into the future and how we in the Nordic Clean Energy Scenarios project foresee the role of bioenergy. And this figure shows the development in one of the 3 scenarios that Kevin just mentioned, the CNN scenario. And as you can see, we foresee a role of bioenergy, which is still quite important, and we also have some slightly increasing use of bioenergy in total. And then we see also a partly changing role of bioenergy in our scenarios, with somewhat less use of bioenergy for power and heat, since we expect direct electrification to take a larger share of the heating. And then as we move towards 2050, we also see an increasing use of biofuels for use in hard to abate sectors. So these are the main trends that are quite similar in all the 3 scenarios that we have analyzed in the project. So these developments raises, of course, some issues and challenges, as bioenergy is not without challenges. And one issue that we have discussed quite a lot in the project and in the report is how can we replace imported biofuels, which is currently quite large, with Nordic sustainably produced biofuels. And the second question, which also occurs from this figure, is can we meet the increasing demand that we foresee in these scenarios? So to discuss that, I will start from the biomass potential side, and this figure is also found in the report, and it shows the estimated potential of biomass from different main sources in the Nordic countries, split into different countries. And it is adapted from a report from Pyrolysis and Nordic Energy Research in 2019. And as you can see, forest biomass is the main potential in the Nordic countries. And if you summarize all these potentials, we're close to 500 terawatt hours of bioenergy potential per year in the Nordic region, which is significant, definitively. Zooming a bit into the largest block here, the forest biomass, the potential is split on different types of forest biomass according to this figure. And what I'd like to highlight here is that all these categories are mainly residues and forest industry waste resources with limited alternative uses. At least it's not in conflict with wood for construction and so forth. So these are forest industry residues and waste resources mainly. And indeed, these potentials are uncertain, and they are not settled in stone and fixed forever. So also the forest industry and forest sector is undergoing a transition, and there might be drivers both increasing the biomass potential for energy and decreasing the potential. So two main drivers that may increase these potentials in the long run would be increased use of wood for construction. So that would mean more use of sawn wood, which causes also more sawn wood forest industries residues that might be used for bioenergy. And also another driver would be less use of wood for printing paper, and then more available wood for other purposes, such as bioenergy. On the other hand, there might also be drivers, strong drivers, reducing the potential. One important issue there is increased use of low quality wood for other purposes than energy, like textiles, green chemicals, and so forth, and also extended environmental restrictions to forestry, limiting the harvesting levels and the harvesting potentials could potentially contribute to reduce these potentials that we see in this figure. So having this in mind, it might be interesting to see our results in relation to the estimated potentials. And this is a figure showing only the 2020, 2030, and 2050 levels of bioenergy production in the CNN scenario in our report. And these potentials or these bioenergy levels are first lower than what we have estimated as the Nordic potential. So it is not only the potentials that are limiting bioenergy, it's also other drivers. And one main driver is a higher pace of electrification in transportation than what was expected in a similar report, the NETP 2016, which had a significantly higher amount of especially biofuels in their scenarios. So we have in the recent report still a significant role of bioenergy, but it is below what we regard as the Nordic potentials in our modeling, and it is significantly lower than what was foreseen in the NETP 2016 scenario. Still, it is fair to say that bioenergy and use of bioenergy is not without challenges and trade-offs, and it is indeed subject to discussion. So I will mention three main challenges or trade-offs that needs to be taken into account in developing the future role of bioenergy in the Nordics. And the first one I'd like to mention is, of course, the potentially negative environmental impacts from biomass harvesting in general. Of course, the more we harvest in the woods, the more it may damage or be in conflict to environmental factors, such as the forest as a recreational area, or forest as an arena for also biodiversity. So to address that question, I'd like to show this graph, which shows in this purple figure the harvest levels historically in the Nordic countries, and the annual growth in the light blue, which has been higher than the harvest. And for that reason, we also have seen a growing stock of forest in the Nordic forests during this period of time. So this is not evidence we do environmental friendly forestry, but at least it shows that we have a harvest levels well below the annual increment. So at least I would say it indicates that if we ensure sustainable forest management on the areas we do forestry, and we also set aside some areas for forest conservation, it should be possible to meet these trade-offs in a good way and still have bioenergy and other forest products as an important part of the future energy system and society. Of course, this is an issue that can be discussed in a whole webinar, so but there is no time for that. So I will move on to a second challenge, which is managing the short versus long-term climate impacts, which is probably also a debate many of you know, with the carbon depth debate and the fact that when we burn biomass, we emit carbon to the atmosphere, and if the biomass is from long rotation crops, it might take several decades before the carbon is stored back on the same piece of land. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, if we use biomass and bioenergy, we save some fossil carbon into the atmosphere, which and we will not contribute to increase the carbon levels in the atmosphere in the very long run. So here it's also many solutions, and our advice is to primarily rely on waste resources and forest industry residues, which is part of a larger forest sector value chain where we, as I said, use the waste resources and forest industry residues that would help avoid the solutions with the longest carbon or the largest carbon depths and the longest payback periods at least. Also a topic that could have been discussed in a webinar on its own. And the third trade-off is then the high energy efficiency that we may have by using biomass in heating versus using also fuels for hard to abate sectors. So and this is also a trade-off where Nordic Clean Energy Scenarios is proposing both solutions. We see that the biofuel have lower efficiency than bioheat, but it has, at least in the longer term, higher substitution effects, since it might contribute in hard to abate sectors in deep decarbonization scenarios. On the other hand, and this has become very clear this autumn and winter, bioheat may provide much needed long-term flexibility to a largely electrified heating system. So as we will see more electrified heating systems, not only Nordics, but probably in Northern Europe, we can see that the value of having long-term flexibility solutions such as biomass will become more valuable. And this is also a reason why we see bioenergy and biomass for heating as a main solution all the way towards 2050, but with a somewhat reducing volume due to increased electrification. So trying to wrap up our main key messages on this bioenergy field, we conclude that wood waste and forest industry residues remain important renewable energy resources towards 2050 in all the three scenarios that we present in the report. Biomass can, to a larger extent, be utilized in hard-to-abate sectors, and how much we utilize biomass depends partly on how much we rely also on Power-to-X solutions and also CCS, which will be the topic for the next presentation. It may definitively offer flexibility in the transition, which will be much needed. And I would like to highlight again the need for longer term flexibility solutions as we electrify heating, where also biomass is likely to take a major role. As I've discussed in this presentation, sustainable biomass supply is a key factor for the role of biomass in the long term. And it is also worth to mention that it may deliver negative emissions, which is needed, as Kevin said, to meet the Nordic climate targets through the bioenergy with CCS solutions, which Kenneth will discuss further in a short time. So this was the main points I plan to present, Marcus.
Thanks, Kevin. Now I'd like to invite Harri Laurikka from the Bioenergy Association of Finland. Harri was not part of the core team of the project, but he's been willing to provide us some feedback and discuss the findings here, since he's very much an expert in this field. So we're going to spend now 10 minutes with a short Q&A between Harri and Torjus. And while you listen to that, if you have questions on your own, please go ahead and write those in the Q&A. And if we have time, we're going to pick some of those up in the panel discussion. And if we don't have time, we're going to make sure we answer them afterwards and publish on our website. So please, Harri, welcome and take it away.
Thank you, Marcus, and thank you, Torjus, for the great presentation. Maybe just a few words about the Bioenergy Association of Finland. We represent the bioenergy, biochar, and growing media industries in Finland. And our vision is to develop excellent conditions for development of sustainable and even carbon negative biomass-based products. So we aim at high added value and export, and we believe the sector is part of circular bioeconomy and can strengthen energy self-sufficiency, energy security, and employment. And even if we are a bioenergy association, we believe energy is already now mainly derived from side streams of forest industry and forest management. And we need to pay attention for biodiversity in forests and fields. And we know that we are not perfect at the moment, but this is the vision that we are heading towards. I think the report is very interesting in presenting the 5 solution tracks, a very useful approach. And I would like to start our discussion by asking Torjus about the solution tracks, because you make a distinction between bioenergy and then CCS and BECCS. And I think you also describe how the solution tracks can partly also compete with each other. And I think, Torjus, you said that the development of bioenergy also depends on the other tracks. Now we in the association, we tend to think that the bioenergy sector is an evolving sector where BECCS is in the future will be an ever more important part of the sector, and not necessarily a kind of a competing solution. And similarly, there is a promising link between biogenic CO2 capture and power to X and hydrogen production. So this is a link to another track. So could you elaborate a bit on how you made the distinction to these tracks and how you see these links?
Yes, thank you, Harri. I think you make a good point in this, because it might seem a bit artificial that we divide on bioenergy on the one hand side and then bioenergy with CCS on the other one, which and I can clearly see that you see this as part of an evolving bioenergy sector. So I guess that there are 2 main reasons why we divided the bioenergy with CCS from the rest of the bioenergy in our communication. First, there is for the CCS, there is a need for the specific capture technologies and not least the transportation solutions. So we wanted to dig more into that and the needs for those infrastructure facilities to succeed with the CCS with or without bioenergy. So that was the one of the reasons for dividing. And also secondly, we find it useful to quantify and show the need also for negative emissions in itself, not only the carbon neutral solutions, but also to quantify the negative emissions, which is needed according to our analysis, at least, even in the renewable rich Nordic countries. So these are the two main reasons we did it that way. Okay. But I see your point clearly, yes.
And then the next question I could raise is related to the total bioenergy use in your scenarios. As you showed, it kind of increases in the long term. In the short term, there is a very rapid increase, and then there's a kind of a dip in the total bioenergy use. And I think you mentioned that the share of power and heat will decrease, and the upstream production will increase. But can you say, is there a distinction within the power and heat sector? Can you say a few words about what happens to combined heat and power and heat only plants? Is there a difference, or is there a negative trend in both?
In our CNN, at least, we see a similar trend in the heat only and CHP plants. So, okay. So it's quite similar. I haven't digged into the relative changes and compared them, but it is a similar trend in the two. So if I can also comment on the kind of the pattern of bioenergy use that you mentioned from 2020 onwards, the reason we see this is quite closely linked to the carbon budgets and the quite rapidly declining carbon budgets that we put in as a main restriction in our modeling. So we see that, and of course the technical and economic maturity of different technologies. So you see from 25 onwards that electricity is taking some of the biomass shares in heating and power and heat, or in heating. So that then the biomass for heat starts to decline. And then from 2040 onwards, we start with a even stricter carbon budgets. We have to dig into the hard to abate sectors, and the need for more biofuels for hard to abate sectors starts to kick in significantly, and then you get an overall increase in the bioenergy use again. Having said that, the changes are quite moderate compared to the changes for some of the other technologies in the report, I would say.
Okay. Yeah, and how about the bioenergy CCS? Does it have an impact later on in the development of the total bioenergy use? Can you see that in the results, or?
Yeah, I think Kenneth will come back to it, but yeah. Not, and I won't spoil all of it. But the bioenergy with CCS comes in late in the period towards 2050, and with an increasing volume. And we also see that some of the CHP plants is actually kept in the Nordic region to secure negative emissions from bioenergy CCS in our scenarios. So. But I guess you will get more details on that one from Kenneth later.
Yeah. Then I think what you said about the trade-offs and the management of trade-offs was very, very interesting on slide 20, for example, and it's a very crucial issue. I think it's quite clear that we need to improve our performance with biodiversity and do that together in the forest-based forest-based sectors. I think this is important since harvesting for industry and energy are integrated. There is no separate kind of energy wood harvesting. And I would argue that this is important for BECCS as well in the future and in the long term.
Yes.
And maybe related to the trade-offs, just to mention that my association and the Finnish energy industries, we recently published recommendations for our membership on how to take into account biodiversity in harvesting of energy wood. And this consisted of 3 parts. First was sustainable forest management. The second one was increasing the amount of dead wood in actively managed forests which are in economic use. And the third one was then reporting of the biomass origin. So those kind of 3 main elements in the recommendations, and we of course hope that our members then actively use those.
So Harry, could I jump in here? Well, thanks by the way for your very insightful comments. It's impressive knowledge of the report. I just wanted to ask you, is there anything here that surprised you or kind of goes against what you've found in your analysis and the studies that you've seen elsewhere? Or this kind of in line with your own thinking and analysis?
Well, I think, generally the impact on the energy sector was quite high in your study, I think, in comparison to, for example, domestic studies in Finland. We see an increasing trend even in recent publications by the VTT, which are made domestically here. We see an increasing trend, a moderate but still increasing trend in the power sector as well. So that is maybe one a bit surprising element. And then another one is the very strong impact of or the very strong need for negative emissions. And the numbers, we can discuss that later, but they are quite high, I think, even in relatively short term by 2035.
Yeah. Yeah, we do have a couple of questions around that actually related to BioCCS in the chat as well. So I'm going to leave those, but I want to pick up on one of your questions that we also see in the Q&A here related to the sort of balance between using bioenergy versus electricity for heat. So the question that was posed, I'm going to rephrase it a little bit, is whether we can actually afford to use so much electricity and not use bioenergy for heating purposes, given the sort of the high quality, if you wish, of the energy carrier that is electricity. So wouldn't you expect to see more bioenergy for heat than what we do? So that's a question for you, Torjus. What drives that?
Good question. What drives it is the expectation of cleaner electricity production, mainly through wind power, which is also controversial, and then also using heat pumps to a larger degree for the heating. So we get a very good energy efficiency measure in terms of that change. So and then also we see that there is a limited biomass potential, and we see that we need it for many purposes, not only in the energy sector, but also for other purposes where biomass can replace fossil products. So we have been a bit reluctant in foreseeing a too high use of bioheat in the Nordic forest sector. But I would like to stress again the need for the Nordic energy system to keep a flexible, or even further develop a flexible heating system that can rely on both electricity when electricity supply is high and demand is low and prices are low, but that can also use other sources in situations like this when the electricity prices for one reason or another is very high, we need the backup and we need the flexibility to also use other sources. And I think looking at the flexibility solutions, I'm quite optimistic regarding the solutions for short-term flexibility, like moving load from an hour to the next or from one day to the next. But there are fewer obvious solutions for this need for longer-term flexibility, like some weeks of cold weather and little wind in the Nordics. We would need some backup and some alternatives to the electricity.
Well, thanks. I'm going to welcome you back in about 20 minutes, both Harri Laurik of the Bioenergy Association of Finland and Torjus Polke, who's been leading our work on Bioenergy. But now let's turn to the issue of bio-CCS and CCS, so carbon capture and storage. We've already talked about it a little bit, but let me now invite Kenneth Karlsson of IVL, Swedish Environmental Research Institute, and also Energy Modeling Lab. He's got dual hats on, who's actually been heading our integrated modeling work also in this project. So he's got a very central role in the analysis, not only on the carbon capture and storage, but also on the entirety of the project. So please, Kenneth, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction, Marcus. And I will take up the topic that was, as you could hear, very related also to bioenergy, and that is the need for carbon capture and storage that we see in the Nordic countries in the future. And I will start to explain what we have included in the analysis. And I could also see there were some questions about what is the difference between carbon neutrality and climate neutrality, and I hope I can explain that with this figure. So we have direct CO2 emissions from burning of fossil fuels and biomass, so all burning of fuels, and that is normally the CO2 included in the targets for the different countries, and we track that on different industries or different sectors. So that is dark blue here. So that is all conversion of energy that emits CO2. We have included in our energy system model. And we track the development of technologies there and the fuel use and so on, so we can track the emissions from there. Then there's the not so dark blue international transport, which is a bit of a piece that you don't really know where to put, because it's not a part of the national targets. International transport have its own targets, and here we're talking about shipping and aviation. So, but we have it included in the model, in energy system model, because the fuels used in this sector is really important for the rest of the system. That is where we need many of these future fuels, power to X fuels, and so on. And that's one of the hard to abate sectors. So we can't really look at the transition of the energy system without taking into account that we need to produce fuels for this international transport. Then we have the non-CO2, and that is emissions from industrial processes like cement industry, aluminium, and so on. And there are also emissions from farm animals in that part. Then we have the land use and land use change, the white one here. And that is the change in emissions of greenhouse gases when we change the use of land, like increase area with forest, as you just heard Torjus saying that we're doing. And having a negative number here means that we have on average for the Nordic countries, we have an uptake in land use and land use change. And that basically means we're increasing our forest area. So these are the different parts. And as I said, we have the dark blue and the international transport in our models. So when we look at the total energy system, assumptions for non-CO2 and LULUCF is taken outside the model. And that influences also the result. So I want also to explain a bit about that. But first, also a few words more about the modeling setup that we are using. So we have two energy system models. And the one I will show results from, and the main results that are also shown on the result homepage we have published as part of this project, is the Open Nordic Times model, the on-times model. And that is an optimization model. It's a model that invests in future It includes all sectors. So we have all the sectors you saw before: transport, agriculture, industry, different types of industries, residential, and so on. And we feed it with how the energy system looks today. And then we put in the targets that I will show you in a minute. And then the model finds the cheapest solutions to meet these targets in the future. So we feed it with all the information we have about new technologies that we can see coming within each sector. And that is the technology data and assumption bucket you can see here that goes into the model. Then to check that the trade of electricity and so on is reasonable and expansive of power grid, then we have a power system model called BAMRAL that covers the whole European power system. So we can get the future development in that, and that gives like framework conditions to the Nordic countries. So we have how does the power prices develop in the surrounding countries, and what kind of import and export can we expect of power to the other countries. So the Open Nordic Times model that we will look at results from now only have the 5 Nordic countries, but it covers all sectors in these countries. And from both of these, we can, of course, get scenario results out that we can that you can see documented in our report. So a bit more about how we come to the targets that we are, or the framework that we are using for the model to control the model scenarios. So here I'll show you the total greenhouse gas emissions from the Nordic system. And what you can see is that we have the different parts that you saw before. So we have land use change at the bottom. It's negative because we have net uptake in this. Then we have the non-CO2, which is positive here, which is industry and farm animals, and that keeps having a positive output. Then we have energy-related CO2, and that is the thing that we look at in the model. So that is what we can change in the model. And that gives us then the net greenhouse gas emission, which is the blue one. So with this, you can see for all the Nordic countries in all the scenarios, we go to net zero in CO2 by 2050. But actually, if you look at the total amount of greenhouse gases, we go net zero before 2040. So there's the difference between looking at greenhouse gases and CO2. But that's not enough. So this is, you can see the basic constraint is that the model, which tells the model it has to follow the yellow line here, that because that is the emissions we're tracking in the model. But that said, this looks different from country to country because we also in the project had, we are also taking the national targets into account. So for each country is fulfilling their official national target. So that means that like Denmark have a 70% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2030 and has to be greenhouse gas neutral in 2050. And that you can see, so that is for the blue line. So that fits here. But that means that we have to go negative with CO2. So we need negative emissions because we still have some emissions from industry and farm animals in the future. So this forces the model to go negative. And that is where we say we see the need for negative emissions. In Iceland, this is even stronger because they have a very ambitious target of getting greenhouse gas neutral by 2040. And as they have high LULUCF positive emissions there, they have to compensate for that by going negative with the CO2. So they have to capture a lot of CO2 to hit the target in 2040. And then we have countries like Norway and Sweden, who has a growing forest. So they have a quite high net uptake in the forest, which means that to reach a certain greenhouse gas targets, they don't need to reduce so fast on the CO2 emissions. Then Sweden, in any case, has a target for CO2 emission that they also have to go to zero in 2045. So Sweden has like tightened the targets on themselves, and that means actually that the greenhouse gases go pretty quite negative, and it goes negative already around in a few years actually. So you have very different setups for the different countries, and that also means that the models will also choose different solutions for the different countries affected by these different constraints. So this is just to explain a little bit about the different types of greenhouse gas emissions we have in the model and how it can actually affect the results. But that doesn't move our main conclusion that we actually see that we need negative emissions in the Nordic system. And we need to see already a ramp up from today or from 2025 until 2035. So actually we need to ramp up very fast from now to meet, and that is because many of the countries have quite strong targets in 2030, 2035. So, and if you look at the different parts coming in here, you can see bioenergy plays a very important role. It is mainly bioenergy with CCS that carries the negative emissions. We also have CCS on waste incineration, that is also obvious. And then we see some on some refineries, upstream products, and also on steel industry is coming in, and later hydropyrolysis. So this is production of biochar to put out on the farmland. Biogas also plays a small role in this. And what we see is, and that can also be seen from this figure actually, that most of the CO2 we are capturing is from biogenic sources. So potentially we can turn it into negative emissions if we put it on the ground. But we also use CCS on the fossil fuels, and that is mainly we see it in the steel industry. Still continue using coal, but just with CCS in the future. And then we are using some of these, so we're not putting all the CO2 in the ground. We're actually reusing some of the CO2 for fuel production for power-to-X fuels in the future. And as I told you about these national targets, that they influence the need for negative emissions in the different countries, but also the situation in the country have influence on that. So if we look at our different scenarios, see the range in how much we expect is needed of negative emissions. This is what is shown here on the map. And that depends a lot of the development and cost of CCS technologies and also acceptance of these solutions. But if we take a look at the different countries, we can see like Iceland and Denmark is pretty much, they need negative emissions no matter what. So there's a strong case that Iceland and Denmark, they have to go for CCS. Sweden varies a lot depending on the assumption on cost and so on, because if CCS becomes too expensive, then it will be more efficient, economically feasible to replace fossil fuels in the heavy industry than going for CCS. Norway do not have so many emissions, so they really their main emissions is from transport, and transport we cannot use CCS. So Norway will more be a storage country for others, so themselves do not need so much negative emissions. And also Finland is more or less in the same boat as Sweden, that they have they can switch, they can focus switching fuels instead of using CCS to avoid some of use of the CCS. So they are more flexible in that solution. But in general, we see a lot of quite some negative emissions needed in the Nordic scenarios. And what then? Is that a good, do we have, is the Nordic prepared for this, the need for CCS? And there you can look at different things. So one thing is, do we have storage facilities? And the simple answer to that is yes, we have abundant storage facilities. Iceland, if we look at the need for storing this amount for each country that we see is needed from 2050, then I translated that into how many years they could store that. So just in Iceland, they have for more than they can store their emissions for more than 200 years. The storage needs, they can cover that for more than 200 years. Norway can cover it for more than 1,200 years. And Denmark more than 700 years, and Sweden more than 50 years. And this is just like there are probably more options than this. So what we see is that the Nordic countries are really well suited for storing CO2, and probably will also be a business case in the future to import CO2 from other parts of Europe and the world and store it in the Nordic countries. But is things then moving? So this part we didn't have in the report. It was just made a fast screening on what is going on in the Nordic countries. So this is not covering everything, but just to have an idea, are we getting started on this? So one thing is we're saying we need this very soon, and we need to ramp up very fast. So to do that, we should already have been started. And actually, if we look at that, Iceland have already online projects, both capture and storage. Not enough capacity as compared to what they need, but they also still have years to ramp up. So they are started. Norway are also starting a capturing project very soon, and it already using oil field reservoirs to store CO2 also from former projects. And the scaling up is possible here. I couldn't see how fast the plans were for that. In Denmark, we have projects going on on waste incineration and the cement industry. And also we have a so-called biochar project, the Pyrolysis, also in test phase. So they expect to be able to capture 1 to 2 million tons of CO2 a year from 25. And on the other hand, also storage are coming online. We have 2 oil fields that are ready to receive very soon from 25. Also, they say CO2 from different sources. And here you can see what they expect from the early years is already enough to take the Danish emissions. But of course, their business case is also to import from other countries. Sweden are also looking into how much they can capture, and they are looking right now on power plants and industry. They're also looking at ramping up from a few million tons to up to 18 million tons in the future as possible outcome. And Sweden, as far as I can see, is mainly looking for other countries' storages, as the Swedish storage are not so large. But there's plenty of storage in Denmark and Norway. So we can see we have kicked this off. The development is started, but also that to reach the point that we see is needed in our scenarios, we really have to push this development and make sure that it continues and ramps up. So what have we included in our modeling? Of course, we can't include everything, but we're trying to cover like the main technologies that can capture the CO2. So we have post-combustion solutions. So that is, you can add a CO2 capture unit on power plants and heating plants to extract CO2 from the flue gas. We also have Oxy Fuel Plants in the model, in the database. We don't see those coming in, but that is a power plant where you use pure oxygen in the combustion, and that means that the flue gas you get out is CO2, so it's very easy to collect afterwards. But they're a bit more expensive, so it's only a matter of price and competition if they can come in or not. Biogas can help both in producing biogas. You are making sure that you're not emitting methane, but it's CO2 instead. Then you can also collect the CO2, especially when you upgrade biogas to natural gas levels and feed it into the natural gas grid, for instance. Then we have direct air capture, where you just need electricity and heat to capture CO2 directly from the atmospheric air. This is, for now, quite expensive. But later on in the period, like after 2040, we could see it could come in, and it really depends on how this develops. So here you don't need a CO2 source; you can capture directly from the air. And then we have the pyrolysis, so that is heating of biomass. So you produce a biochar and some gas that can be used for fuels, but the biochar can then just be spread on farmland, and that should be quite stable, so you can actually store CO2 directly in the farmland and at the same time improve the soil. And to give you an idea how we are keeping track on all these streams in the model, so this is a simplified diagram of the CO2 flows in the model. So we have fossil fuels or biomass coming in to different sectors. So It can go into industry, for instance, and then depending on if it's fossil fuels or biomass, we track if the CO2 coming out there is from biogenic CO2 or fossil fuel CO2. And then this CO2 goes to a network. So we also have like investments in some piping or shipping or transport of this. And this CO2, when it comes into that network, then it's in principle a mix of the different sources of CO2, and then it can then be transported to storage, or it can go into utilization, mixing with hydrogen in different ways to create different types of fuels. So all this, so the model looks at this whole picture and find what is the cheapest solution, taking into account that we have to fulfill the climate targets that I told you about in the beginning. So it's always the constraint that we have to fulfill all the national targets, but the model have all these options to play around with. So it can also use electricity just to store, take out CO2 directly from the air. It can use the biogas track that I just told about. And then we have the biochar track in the bottom. The LULUCF, the yellow ones down here, is not included in the model, so that is dependent on the assumption we did outside the model. So of course, if you increase forestry more faster, it could take up more CO2, but that is fixed for all the scenarios, how the development in forestry and so on is. But that's also something you can play around with, of course, if you want to see how you could meet the greenhouse gas targets of the Nordic countries. Then we also see that the different countries go for different solutions, and that depends both on their individual targets, but also on their possibilities, the options available in the country. So if you take Denmark and Finland, they go very much from CHP and heating plants with CCS. So here we have the close link between biomass, bioenergy, and CCS. And actually, the need for negative emissions in Denmark keeps a lot of CHP, biomass CHP plants online and even expanding the heat production from biomass in the future because the need of negative emissions. So we could say the negative emissions drive this, that we keep these thermal plants, but also this can also give the security that Toyo was talking about, that we have backup in colder periods. Iceland is a special case because the cheapest option is to import biomass to Iceland and do negative emissions, but Iceland will not do that properly. So they will go for direct air capture, which is already happening in Iceland. And if we have the different sensitivities in models, so if you turn off biomass import to Iceland, you will see Iceland switching to direct air capture. Norway and Sweden are a bit different because here we see the heavy industries as the main industries where they are using CCS. And I'll come back to the competition here. It's not like this is printed in stone that this is how it will be, because there is close competition between these different solutions. And what we see also is the waste incineration. Most countries is also an obvious choice to put CCS on that. So the drivers for carbon capture, as I said, are different in the different countries. So in Denmark and Iceland, is basically the need for negative emissions is really driving these solutions. And the cheapest option so far we see is using BECCS or biomass power plants, biomass CHP and heating plants with CCS. Norway have easy access to storage, so they have a lot of options to actually utilize CCS, even though they don't have like a strong drive from their targets or from their use of energy as it looks now. But in the future, talking about producing blue hydrogen, that could be, which I know Norway is discussing a lot, then the storage is much needed, of course, for the CO2 from stripping the CO2 from the natural gas. Sweden and Finland have a lot of heavy industries where replacing of fossil fuels can be costly, and therefore CCS option can be an alternative. What we see though is that some of these industries are actually going for green solutions. And that, if they're doing that, that will then release some, you can say, some space for other sectors to not go forward so heavily and maybe reduce the need for CCS. And this figure is just to show that it's not that we can say so very sure that it will be BECCS that will solve our problem or give the negative emissions, or it will be heavy industry. One thing is that if you look at the investment cost of a plant and then see what it costs, that is one thing. But how will this plant actually run in reality, or and we can't see how it runs in reality. We can see how it runs in the model. So this is an example of what a value the different plants can get in the model. And you can see the price on the CO2 captured. And if you go for BECCS, waste, and cement here in this case, they are very close. Steel is a bit below cement in our assumptions here in our model. So that is why steel comes in and cement not. But they are so close, so you can't really say which is the winner in here. So it will be more the choice of the different sectors and industries and what the local governments are pushing for that will help us choose what solution to go for. As we see, we both have the need for negative emissions because we have some countries that have emissions from non-energy users and from LULUCF. But we also have these hard to abate sectors where we see industry as the biggest, and also some upstream, some refineries and some heavy transport. And that is also where we need negative emissions to compensate for this. So we see it in our scenarios that we go from greenhouse gas emission around 170 million ton in 2020 to 33 million ton in 2050. And then these 33 million ton are compensated with negative emissions in the model scenario. So jumping to some key messages, and that is really hard because there can be so many messages taken out of this and also so many discussions to go on with. But we see that negative emissions are necessary to reach carbon neutrality, and I think that is seen by almost by all the governments in the Nordics as projects are started and support giving to test plants and test facilities and so on. And what we see is that 12% of the needed emission reduction in the future comes from carbon capture and storage in our scenario. And we see most of the captured CO2 is from biogenic sources. So here we have the very close link to the bioenergy and CCS to get the negative emissions. But also municipal waste is a source of C coming in all the scenarios. Yeah, we see if you look at projects going on, then we see in Norway and Iceland are currently leading that. They actually have online projects working, but the other countries are really catching up and starting projects that will become online. Then most of them before 25. And as I said in the beginning, the Nordic countries are really well suited for CCS because we have close to our emission points. We have huge storage facilities, and we have all the knowledge from the oil and gas industry to transport to put it down the ground again and so on. So we can transfer, you can see companies before working with getting oil and gas up of the ground, they can start putting CO2 down the ground. And these are also the companies we see starting doing this, planning for this. And as I said, the competition between different solutions is very tight. So we can't say pick a winner in this. We get some results in our scenarios that is based on the cheapest option seen from the model side, but these are very uncertain how the prices will develop for the different technologies. So you can see the amount of negative emissions we need is that conclusion is quite solid, but how to actually obtain it is not so solid. That is very much up to debate, and let's see what solution moves fastest in the nearest future.
Thank you very much, Kenneth. Now I'd like to invite our second discussant. It's Philipp Johnson, who's a professional in energy systems analysis at Chalmers. Please go ahead, Philipp.
Okay, thank you very much, Marcus, and thank you, Kenneth, for very interesting presentation. So I have a whole list of questions. I think we could discuss that for quite some time, but time is limited. Yeah, and I'm Philipp Johnson. I work at Chalmers University of Technology. So I've been involved in CCS-related matters for quite some years. But if I start with I mean, I think this is very interesting. This is about the Nordic cooperation, and maybe, I mean, I have sort of a picture that the Nordic, the structure of the Nordic countries in terms of industry is sort of different. So in that context, maybe just generally, what do you think? Could CCS be something that sort of unite the Nordic countries? I mean, obviously, as you mentioned, we have, for instance, in Sweden, we obviously need, over the foreseeable future, I think we need to store our CO2 in Norway and perhaps in Denmark. Yeah. What do you think in that context? Would this work, or how much of coordination is required here, or would the market fix this?
I think definitely that the CO2 infrastructure should be a place for coordination between the Nordic countries, because we are risking a lot of like double investments on competing investments in the Nordics if we are not coordinating this. And like starting where do we want to store the CO2 in the first place? What kind of means are we going to use ships or piping and so on? Especially if we're going for piping, that needs to be coordinated between the countries. And also, if we look at where future production of electric fuels will be situated, because there will be a need for CO2 in these places. So this whole kind of thing of planning, where do we expect things to be placed in the future? I think that's very important if we can coordinate that among the Nordic countries. And I can see it should be a common interest to make the best solution across the Nordic countries and not compete too much on the solutions.
Yeah, so we'll hope that this will be a test of the Nordic cooperation, perhaps. But going into more directly to your modeling results, you show this quite strong ramp up of negative emissions. I mean, I realize it's an outcome of the optimization model, but if we take Sweden as an example, then the negative emissions are supposed to be a part of what we refer, or the government refer to as supplementary measures, I think it's called in English, meaning that the main aim is to offset emissions in sort of hard to abate sectors like agriculture and maybe aviation and so on. But so could there be I mean, if you look at your modeling results, that could sort of be a bit contradictory there, that it will be, I mean, shouldn't we focus on mitigating fossil fuel emissions first, and then a bit further down the road, we should go to these hard to abate sectors? So it seems that your modeling results are not entirely in line with at least from a Swedish policy perspective. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, but I think it is also really have to do what is the framework for the analysis, because we're putting the national targets and then we ask the models to find the cheapest solution. And with the knowledge we have of the technologies in place, it is cheaper for some of the heavy industries to use CCS than to totally switch the production facilities into like the steel industry. But as we see in Sweden, the steel industry are thinking about this transition. So if they are doing that in Sweden, then of course there will be less need for CCS. So it really depends on what development we see. But also I would rather like turn it a bit around, but because we are getting, as I said, this is based on the targets for the countries, but actually and we see there's a lot of options in industries and so on not utilized in our model because they're more expensive. But if we're utilizing it, that just means that we could go even further, that we can move faster to net zero, like in a country like Sweden and so on. So we'd rather use it like that, that we can actually do more if we really wanted to. But it's a result of the framework and using optimization models. But I totally understand your question. But yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I realize we sort of running out of time, but maybe just finally, what about flexible combined heat to power combined with bioenergy CCS? I realize your modeling is not really time resolved, but what do you think about that? Or general flexibility in how much could that contribute to maybe put a bit less pressure on these challenges that obviously your modeling results show?
I think that would be very important, and we see it coming in Denmark and Finland, the CHPs with CSS, bio CHPs with CSS, and it's just because I said these trade-offs, we see that it's not coming in Sweden, but it's so close, so it could just as well also be the solution in Sweden to go for biomass plants with CCS.
Thanks a lot. I had a lot more would be of interest to have a longer discussion about Marcus. I guess then you will sort of.
Well, yeah, thanks, Philip. We can certainly go on for a bit longer if we had time, but I'm sure we're going to get back to us to this discussion further down the line. But I'd like to give a last chance to actually Harri Laurikka of the Bioenergy Association of Finland, since you also you mentioned that some of the results around bio CCS were maybe not quite what you expected. Do you want to elaborate a little bit before we wrap up today?
Yeah, thanks, Marcus, and thanks, Kenneth, for the presentation, and Philip for the comments. Yeah, I was a bit surprised on the results for negative emissions, in particular regarding Finland. The number was quite high, and maybe not so in the long term. It's not surprising, but also in the short term. I think Finland was the #1 user of negative emissions, both in 2035 and 2050, and with a high focus on BECCS. And I think this is just interesting. I think it was more than 7 million tons. And I think if I look at the current state of affairs now in Finland, we quite don't see that development. There is a very much focus on CCU in Finland and many research projects, but not so much on CCS. So something would need to change very rapidly if we would like to achieve those results that we see here. Actually, last week there was a new report by VTT for our climate and energy strategy, and they actually excluded CCS from as a solution for the industry. Maybe that tells a bit something about the attitude in the Finnish market.
So, Kenneth, do you want to give a very brief, like a 20-second response to that?
Yeah, and it has the size of the negative emissions in Finland also have a lot to do with the flexibility in the system that we have modeled here. And I must say it is the VTT modelers who have been involved in this project doing that. So it might be that they have in the new study you say have been more optimistic on replacing some of the fossil fuels. Actually, we have some there's in some sectors like power and heat and also industry. There were some fossil fuels that couldn't be replaced here, and therefore it needed more negative emissions. But these things are moving all the time as new options appear and so on.
Yeah. Well, thanks a lot. And again, a very special thank you to Harri Laurikka of the Bioenergy Association of Finland and to Philipp Johnson of Chalmers University of Technology, who helped us with insightful comments. And of course, thank you to all who listened in. And just a final reminder, there's another seminar in the series on January 19. Then we'll focus on electrification, both direct electrification and indirect through power to X and hydrogen and so forth. So please do sign up on our website for that if you're interested. With that, thanks for listening and have a very Merry Christmas.